Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. The photograph sits innocently in a weathered album, nestled between fading memories of a bygone era, the dawn of the 20th century, when photography still possessed a certain mystique, a permanence that commanded reverence. The image shows a family gathered in solemn formation, their Edwardian attire speaking to the formality of the occasion. Black crepe and mourning clothes frame stiff, unsmiling faces, as was customary for funeral photography of 1901. The deceased, a small child, perhaps 5 or 6 years of age, rests in a white coffin, carefully positioned in the center of the composition. The family stands around this central figure, father rigid and stoic, mother's face partially obscured by a black veil, siblings arranged by height, their expressions trained into appropriate gravity. It is a scene repeated countless times in an age when mortality claimed the young with merciless regularity. For over a century, this photograph remained tucked away, passing between generations who gradually lost connection to the identities of those captured within its silver halide embrace. Names became whispers, then faded entirely. The context, a tragic but unremarkable family loss, reduced to merely ancestors by descendants who preferred happier keepsakes. Until recently, when a great-granddaughter inherited a trunk of family heirlooms and began the painstaking process of cataloging these fragments of her lineage. With modern scanning technology, she enlarged the image, seeking clues to identify the forgotten family members. That's when she noticed something the original family, in their grief, had somehow overlooked. The child in the coffin, the supposedly deceased child, shows subtle signs of life. Look closely at the fingers. There is no rigor mortis. While most funeral photographs show hands carefully arranged, often clutching flowers or religious items, this child's right hand appears to be mid-movement, capturing the slightest blur of motion. The chest, too, seems to hold the gentle swell of inhalation. Most damning of all are the eyes, not fully closed as would be proper for a funeral preparation. Instead, through partially opened lids, there appears to be the glassy reflection of consciousness. This was no deceased child, but one still clinging to life, perhaps in the throes of a condition that mimicked death closely enough to fool grieving parents and inexperienced country doctors in an age before sophisticated medical equipment. One wonders what happened after the photograph was taken. Did someone notice movement as the photographer packed away his equipment? Or was the child truly buried alive, becoming one of the many terrifying cases that led to the invention of safety coffins with bells and breathing tubes? The family records remain disturbingly silent on this matter. No follow-up photographs exist of this particular child. No documents clarify whether a miraculous recovery occurred or whether the tragedy deepened beyond imagination. All that remains is this single chilling image, a moment frozen in time when a family mourned a death that had not yet occurred, blind to the living breath still moving within the small body they prepared to commit to the earth. The daguerreotype specialist who examined the image confirmed my suspicions. "There are definitive signs of vitality here," she explained, her magnifying glass hovering over the child's partially opened eyelid. Post-mortem photography followed strict conventions. The positioning of the head, the arrangement of the hands. This doesn't conform to those patterns. I spent weeks tracing the lineage through census records and parish registries. The family name, Caldwell, appeared consistently in the small mining town of Harrogate. They had suffered like many families of their era, losing 3 children before the age of 10. But one detail stood out. A daughter named Elizabeth, recorded as deceased in April of 1901, then mysteriously reappearing in the 1910 census. Catalepsy. The word surfaced repeatedly in medical journals from the period, a condition causing such profound immobility and reduced respiration that it could be mistaken for death. In an era before stethoscopes became commonplace in rural communities, when doctors often pronounced death based on absence of visible breath on a mirror held to the lips, such mistakes occurred with disturbing frequency. The Harrogate Historical Society yielded a brittle newspaper, dated 3 days after the photograph. A small article, barely 3 inches of column space, reported a miraculous occurrence at the Caldwell home when young Elizabeth, thought departed, awakened during funeral preparations. The article framed it as divine intervention, noting how the child opened her eyes as sunlight from the parlor window touched her face during the final photographic memorial. I found Elizabeth's death certificate, the real one, from 1967. She had lived a full life, married a shopkeeper named Thomas Wellingford, and raised 4 children of her own. Yet nowhere in the family records, diaries, or letters preserved by descendants is there mention of her near burial. The incident, apparently too traumatic, or perhaps too shameful for the family, was systematically erased from their narrative, except for this photograph, which tells the truth through its subtle inconsistencies. What psychological scars must Elizabeth have carried? Did she remember the waking nightmare of hearing funeral arrangements discussed around her paralyzed form? Did the flash of the camera somehow stimulate her nervous system enough to begin breaking through the cataleptic state? Or was it truly, as the newspaper suggested, the warm spring sunlight that revived her? The photographic practices of that era required subjects to remain motionless for extended periods. Perhaps it was during this enforced stillness that someone, the photographer, a family member, noticed the almost imperceptible rise and fall of the child's chest, the slight twitch of fingers that the camera captured as blur. This photograph represents a moment of liminality, a child suspended between worlds, a family poised between deepest grief and astonished joy. It reminds us how tenuous our grasp on life's certainties really is, how easily we can misinterpret the evidence before our eyes. Most chilling is how close Elizabeth came to becoming one of the unknown statistics, those buried before their time, whose awakening came too late, in the suffocating darkness beneath 6 feet of soil. The photograph found its way to my desk at the university archives through Elizabeth's great-grandson, Michael Wellingford, who sought answers to this family mystery. What began as academic curiosity quickly evolved into something more personal as I delved deeper into the phenomenon of premature burial in the early 20th century. There were more safeguards than people realize, explained Dr. Harriet Pembroke, a medical historian I consulted. While rural areas lacked sophisticated equipment, many undertakers employed waiting periods of 24 to 72 hours precisely because of catalepsy concerns. The Caldwell's haste was unusual even for that time. This raised questions about why the family rushed the funeral arrangements. Financial records revealed that Jonathan Caldwell, Elizabeth's father, had been facing mounting debts from the failing family business, a small textile operation struggling against industrial competition. A child's funeral was expensive enough without prolonged viewing periods requiring additional preservation measures. The family doctor's ledger, preserved in county records, showed another troubling detail. The Caldwells had purchased substantial life insurance for each family member, uncommon for children in that era. Elizabeth's policy would have paid out £50, enough to save their business from creditors. I hesitated to suggest the unthinkable, but the evidence painted a disturbing possibility. Had financial desperation clouded the parents' judgment? Did they perhaps see what they needed to see when Elizabeth fell into her cataleptic state? The photographer's identity provided another crucial piece. William Morley was known throughout the region not just for his memorial photography, but for his outspoken advocacy regarding burial reforms. His journal, donated to the Harrogate Historical Society decades ago but rarely examined, contained a telling entry dated the very day of Elizabeth's photograph. Called to the Caldwell home under most distressing circumstances, the child appeared unusual compared to other subjects in repose, employed longer exposure than customary, partly by design. My suspicions were confirmed when preparing the flash powder, observed definite eye movement, alerted the family immediately despite father's initial resistance. Mother became hysterical with relief. A physician was summoned who administered stimulants. Providence guided my hand today. Elizabeth's survival hadn't been mere chance or divine intervention, but the deliberate action of an observant professional whose experience with the dead gave him unique insight into this living child. Most poignant was the small diary I discovered among Elizabeth's personal effects, started in 1912 when she was 16. The first entry reads, "Mother says I must never speak of the sleep, but how can I forget what I heard while trapped inside myself? Father arguing with Dr. Mills about costs, mother weeping, my siblings told not to touch me. I remember the cold of the coffin, the smell of lilies, the terrible helplessness. Sometimes I still dream I'm there, screaming without sound. They say I was saved by a miracle, but I know better. I was saved by the man with the camera whose name nobody will tell me. Someday I'll find him and thank him for seeing me when everyone else looked away." Elizabeth eventually did meet William Morley again. County records show she apprenticed in his photography studio during her late teens. Perhaps working beside the man who saved her life provided some healing from that traumatic day when her family gathered to mourn a death that hadn't happened. The photograph's revelation sent me on a pilgrimage to Harrogate Cemetery, where rows of weathered headstones stand as silent witnesses to a century of the town's history. Among them, I found a small plot with a peculiar feature, an empty space where a child's grave should have been, the surrounding Caldwell family markers creating a conspicuous absence. Cemetery records confirmed my suspicion. A grave had been prepared for Elizabeth, but never filled. The caretaker's log from 1901 contained a hastily crossed-out entry, with "Cancelled Providential Recovery" scrawled in the margin. More disturbing was what I discovered beneath the photograph when I carefully removed it from its backing paper. A small card with faded ink that read, "Second instance this year. Must speak to medical board about provincial testing standards." This suggested that William Morley had encountered similar cases before Elizabeth's. I traced Morley's correspondence through university archives, finding letters to medical journals about what he called the living dead phenomenon. His observations were largely dismissed by the medical establishment as the fanciful notions of an untrained photographer. Yet Morley had documented 23 suspected cases of premature burial preparations in his 30-year career. "The camera sees what the grieving eye cannot," he wrote in 1898. That imperceptible motion, the subtle relaxation of features no corpse could maintain, these speak to life lingering beyond apparent death. Elizabeth's later diaries revealed another layer to her story. Throughout her life, she experienced recurring episodes of catalepsy, though none as severe as her childhood incident. She described these episodes with chilling clarity. "The paralysis comes without warning. I am entombed in flesh, fully aware yet unable to signal my consciousness. Each time, I fear I will be overlooked again." These episodes shaped Elizabeth's life in profound ways. She insisted her bedroom door remain unlocked. She wore a special bracelet engraved with instructions about her condition. Most telling was her insistence on being cremated rather than buried. Her will contained 5 separate mentions of this requirement. In 1929, Elizabeth established the Harrogate Society for Prevention of Premature Interment, which provided special, waiting mortuary facilities where bodies could remain under observation before burial. The Society's records show that between 1930 and 1950, they documented 7 cases of individuals who showed signs of life after being pronounced dead. The final piece of this puzzle emerged when I contacted Elizabeth's only surviving grandchild, Margaret Wellingford, now 93. She remembered her grandmother's absolute terror of doctors. "She never trusted medical opinions after what happened," Margaret explained. "She told me once that during her sleep, she could hear the doctor telling her parents it was merciful, that she had passed quickly. She believed some doctors were too quick to pronounce death when treatment seemed futile or expensive." Margaret provided me with one last artifact, a silver locket Elizabeth wore throughout her life. Inside was not a family photograph as one might expect, but a tiny fragment of flash powder paper from Morley's camera. "She called it her resurrection token," Margaret said. "Grandmother believed the flash of that camera was what truly awakened her spirit and called her back from darkness." The archived photograph of Elizabeth Caldwell has drawn unexpected attention since my findings were published in the Journal of Historical Thanatology. Scholars of early 20th century medical practices have reached out, but one correspondence particularly disturbed me. A letter from Dr. Evelyn Chambers at Oxford, who recognized similarities to a collection recently donated to their medical history museum. "What you've documented isn't isolated," she wrote. "We've identified at least 17 cases between 1895 and 1920 with nearly identical circumstances. Rural settings, financial pressures on families, insurance policies, and photographers who intervened. The implications sent me back to Harrogate, this time to examine town financial records. What I discovered suggested something far more systematic than individual tragedies. The town doctor who had pronounced Elizabeth dead, Dr. Mills, served on the board of Prudential Heritage Insurance, the very company that issued policies to most families in Harrogate, including the Caldwells. Insurance claim records showed a disturbing pattern. Families who purchased children's policies from Mills were 3 times more likely to use them within a year compared to those insured elsewhere. Most troubling were his hastily completed death certificates, often citing vague conditions like failure to thrive or infantile weakness, diagnoses impossible to dispute without modern medical knowledge. William Morley's advocacy suddenly appeared not merely humanitarian, but targeted. His photography business records showed he deliberately undercut competitors for funeral photography in cases involving Dr. Mills's patients. He was conducting his own investigation, positioning himself to intervene. I located Morley's great-granddaughter in Edinburgh, who possessed a metal box of documents her family had kept sealed per Morley's instructions, to be opened only when the parties involved are beyond earthly concerns. Inside was evidence that Mills and at least 2 other rural doctors had financial arrangements with both insurance companies and certain undertakers. Morley had meticulously documented 29 cases where he suspected children were being deliberately misdiagnosed as deceased. Elizabeth's was the only case where he had successfully intervened in time. The conspiracy exploits parental grief and rural isolation, Morley wrote in a letter never sent to authorities. Parents, overwhelmed by loss and trusting medical authority, fail to notice signs that contradict the doctor's pronouncement. The insurance money creates a terrible incentive for families in desperate circumstances to accept what they're told without question. Most haunting was Elizabeth's final diary entry from 1967, written days before her actual death. I've spent my life watching for those overlooked by medicine and society. The living dead are everywhere, the elderly sedated into silence in nursing homes, patients declared hopeless and denied treatment, the poor whose symptoms are dismissed. My childhood coffin taught me to see what others ignore, the spark of life persisting despite all efforts to extinguish it. Elizabeth's legacy extends beyond her narrow escape. The Harrogate Society she founded eventually evolved into one of Britain's first patient advocacy organizations. Their archives contain hundreds of cases where they challenged medical authority and prevented premature conclusions, not all involving death, but all centered on the principle that human consciousness deserves the benefit of every doubt. The photograph that started my investigation now resides in the Medical Ethics Museum in London, a somber reminder of how easily life can be overlooked when convenience, economics, and authority conspire against the vulnerable. The photograph of Elizabeth Caldwell has taken me to corners of Victorian medical history I never anticipated exploring when I first began this investigation. Last week, I received an unexpected package from a retired nurse in Cornwall who had read my article. Inside was a worn leather case containing what appeared to be a modified stethoscope, along with a letter explaining its significance. This belonged to Dr. Adelaide Fletcher, who practiced in rural communities during the same period as Elizabeth's incident, the letter explained. She designed this amplified stethoscope specifically to detect the faintest heartbeats in patients pronounced dead by her male colleagues. The instrument featured an ingenious system of acoustic chambers that magnified even the slightest sounds. According to accompanying documents, Dr. Fletcher had revived 11 patients between 1898 and 1905 who had been declared deceased by other physicians. Her meticulous records included a case remarkably similar to Elizabeth's, a 7-year-old boy named Thomas Greaves, who awoke during funeral preparations in 1902. Dr. Fletcher's journals revealed a network of concerned medical practitioners and mortuary workers who communicated discreetly about suspicious cases. William Morley's name appeared several times in her correspondence, confirming they had collaborated in their efforts to prevent premature burials. Most revealing was a coded ledger that, once deciphered, named 17 doctors across England suspected of what Fletcher called death profiteering, declaring patients dead prematurely to trigger insurance payments, from which they received commissions. Dr. Mills of Harrogate featured prominently. I presented this evidence to Professor James Whittaker at the Royal Medical Historical Society, who confirmed that the period represented a perfect storm of conditions enabling such abuse: rudimentary death confirmation techniques, isolated communities, overworked coroners, and minimal oversight of rural medical practices. What's truly remarkable about Elizabeth's case, Professor Whittaker noted, isn't just that she survived, but that she transformed a deeply traumatic experience into a lifelong mission. Many victims of medical malpractice in that era had no recourse whatsoever. Elizabeth's advocacy work extended further than I initially realized. Through the Harrogate Society records, I discovered she had lobbied Parliament for reforms requiring multiple physician confirmations of death and mandatory waiting periods before burial. Though her proposed legislation never passed in her lifetime, similar provisions were eventually incorporated into British medical standards by 1972. I've arranged for Elizabeth's story and the evidence of this wider conspiracy to be featured in an upcoming exhibition at the Science Museum in London titled When medicine fails, patient advocacy through history. The centerpiece will be the photograph that started it all. That extraordinary moment when a family gathered around what they believed was their daughter's corpse, completely unaware she was witnessing her own funeral arrangements. Perhaps most poignant was the discovery that Elizabeth kept a daily journal for 66 years following her near burial. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting the day before she died, reads, "I have lived each day as borrowed time, a gift from that observant man with his camera. We must all look more carefully at what we believe to be finished, for life persists in the most unexpected places, waiting only for someone patient enough to notice its faint but determined signal." The shadow of my research into Elizabeth's case has spread beyond academic interest, manifesting in unexpected ways. Last month, I received a package containing a tarnished tin box discovered during renovations at Harrogate's old hospital. Inside were glass negatives, photographic plates taken by William Morley that never made it to print. These images tell a more complex story than I initially understood. They show Elizabeth in the hours after her revival, her small face reflecting not just confusion but something deeper, a peculiar awareness that seems beyond her years. In one particularly haunting negative, she stares directly at the camera, with an expression suggesting she somehow understood the significance of what had transpired. The hospital renovation also unearthed architectural plans showing a hidden room adjacent to the morgue, equipped with observation windows and recording equipment. According to maintenance logs, Dr. Mills frequently requested this room for private research during the years 1898 to 1904. When I presented this evidence to Dr. Chambers, she theorized something even more disturbing than financial exploitation. These doctors may have been studying cataleptic states systematically. The insurance fraud might have been secondary to medical experimentation on vulnerable subjects. This hypothesis gained credibility when I discovered Mills had corresponded with a neurologist in Vienna who specialized in death-like trances and their potential applications in surgery. Before anesthesia was refined, inducing cataleptic states could provide an alternative for patients undergoing painful procedures. The Harrogate town records revealed another pattern I'd overlooked. Many families who lost children to these vague diagnoses had also participated in sleep therapy sessions with Dr. Mills before their tragedies occurred. Elizabeth's mother had attended 3 such sessions in the month before her daughter's incident. I located Margaret Wellingford again, asking if her grandmother had ever mentioned unusual treatments before her cataleptic episode. Her response chilled me. "Grandmother spoke once of bitter medicine that tasted of almonds," Margaret recalled. She said the doctor insisted it would help her sleep better, but it gave her terrible nightmares where she was frozen but aware. The almond taste strongly suggests cyanide compounds, which in minute doses can induce paralysis without stopping vital functions. These compounds were being explored as potential anesthetics during that era, despite their obvious dangers. Elizabeth's diary contains scattered references to recurring sensations that now take on new meaning. Sometimes I taste almonds though I've eaten none. And then comes the heaviness, the familiar sinking. I fight it harder now. I know what follows. More disturbing still was the discovery that Elizabeth's advocacy work faced systematic obstruction from medical authorities. The Medical Council minutes from 1922 reference a problematic agitator with unfounded theories regarding death certification and strategies to minimize her influence on public perception of medical competence. Despite this opposition, Elizabeth established a small laboratory behind her home where she collaborated with a chemist to analyze suspicious medications. They documented 7 different sedative compounds commonly prescribed to children in their community, publishing their findings anonymously in medical journals. The photograph that began this journey now reveals itself as not merely a document of a near tragedy, but evidence of something more calculated, a child unwittingly caught in a web of medical experimentation, financial exploitation, and institutional protection of dangerous practices that valued research above human life. The implications of Elizabeth's story have rippled beyond historical curiosity into present-day medical ethics. Last week, I received correspondence from Dr. Melinda Harris at the Royal College of Physicians, who discovered files connecting the Harrogate experiments to modern medical protocols. "What began with Dr. Mills wasn't isolated or concluded," she wrote. "His research was quietly absorbed into mainstream medicine. The techniques developed through those questionable catalepsy studies formed the foundation for several induced coma procedures still used today. This connection became clearer when I examined Elizabeth's later advocacy work. In 1947, she had confronted a prestigious London neurologist, Dr. Geoffrey Harman, at a medical conference, publicly accusing him of continuing Mills's research without ethical oversight. Newspaper accounts dismissed her as a hysterical woman with a personal vendetta, but Harman's subsequent papers on temporary neural suspension bear striking similarities to Mills's private notes. Elizabeth had recognized something in Harman's published case studies that others missed: the same pattern of selecting vulnerable, often impoverished patients for experimental procedures with minimal consent processes. Her challenges to his research were systematically excluded from official records of the conference. Perhaps most troubling was my discovery in the Harrogate Society archives of a letter Elizabeth received in 1956 from a nurse who had worked with both Mills and later Harman. The nurse confessed to witnessing dozens of patients deliberately induced into near-death states, some never recovering despite being recorded as successful procedures. The line between research and cruelty became invisible, the nurse wrote. They spoke of patients as subjects, measured the minutes life could be suspended and restored, as if human consciousness were merely another vital sign to manipulate. I've since identified 17 current medical procedures that draw directly from this questionable research lineage. Though refined and made safer, their origins in unethical experimentation remain unacknowledged in medical literature. The photograph of Elizabeth has become something beyond historical evidence. It stands as a warning about how easily vulnerable bodies become sites of experimentation, how medical authority can shield abuse under the guise of progress, and how institutions protect their reputations above individual lives. Elizabeth understood this on an instinctive level from the moment she awakened in that coffin. Her diary entries repeatedly reference an acute awareness of how her body had been treated as an object, positioned, examined, prepared for disposal, all while her consciousness remained trapped within. To be declared dead while living is to understand how easily humanity can be denied, she wrote. They removed my personhood with a pronouncement, transformed me from child to specimen with a single word. I live knowing how fragile our claim to dignity truly is. The shadow of that 1901 photograph stretches across decades, connecting Elizabeth's near burial to questions we still struggle with. Who determines the boundaries between life and death? How do we protect the vulnerable from medical overreach? And whose stories are preserved in our understanding of medical progress? The archival work had consumed nearly 2 years of my life when I received a call from Margaret Wellingford that changed everything. Her voice trembled with age and urgency. I found something else of grandmother's, something she kept hidden even from me until, well, I was instructed to wait until now to open it. 3 days later, I sat in Margaret's cottage examining a small metal box, its lock recently broken. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in Elizabeth's handwriting, to be opened only after all parties are deceased, and 50 years have passed since my death. The letter inside was written on onion skin paper, the ink faded but legible. To whomever seeks the truth of what happened that day, what I have never revealed, what I could not bear to acknowledge even in my diaries, was that I remember everything from my time in the coffin, not just sounds and sensations, but the terrible truth I glimpsed between worlds. I was not merely cataleptic. I was between life and death in a way science cannot explain. During those hours, my consciousness separated from my child's understanding. I saw what was happening from above. I watched my parents' grief, but also witnessed Dr. Mills whispering to father about insurance money while mother was sedated in the next room. More terrifying still, I could see other children, dozens of them, hovering near their own bodies, some recently deceased, others long buried. They spoke to me without words. They showed me their stories, how Mills had administered drops to them as well, pushing them beyond where I had gone, ensuring they would not return as I did. The photographer saw me because I was fighting to return, but the others had already surrendered. They had no advocate. The most horrific revelation came decades later. During my work with the Harrogate Society, I encountered an elderly groundskeeper who confessed that Mills had paid him to retrieve certain bodies shortly after burial. Small, child-sized coffins removed under cover of darkness, transported to the hidden room in the hospital basement. What was done with those bodies, I dare not speculate. The records were destroyed in the hospital fire of 1919. a fire I have long suspected was deliberately set when investigations came too close to the truth. I have carried this knowledge like a stone in my heart. Even as I fought for changes in medical practice, I could never speak of what I had witnessed from that liminal space between worlds. Who would believe a woman claiming to have seen her own funeral from above? Who would accept testimony from a child who had conversed with the dead? I leave this account with no expectation of belief, only as testimony to horrors deeper than I have ever publicly acknowledged. Elizabeth Caldwell Wellingford, March 15, 1967. I sat motionless after reading, the paper trembling in my hands. Margaret watched me with knowing eyes. "There's one more thing," she said quietly, retrieving something wrapped in velvet from a drawer. Grandmother made drawings of the children she saw during her experience. The sketches showed 23 children, each meticulously rendered with names, dates, and addresses noted beneath. I had seen some of these names before, in the insurance records, in Mills's ledger, in the cemetery registry, but 5 of the children Elizabeth had drawn had no death certificates, no funeral records, no graves. They had simply vanished. The implications of Elizabeth's secret testimony compelled me to visit Harrogate Cemetery one final time, not to the well-maintained family plots, but to the far western corner where unmarked graves and paupers' fields stretched beneath overgrown grass. Records from 1900 showed this area had been expanded hastily, with minimal documentation. The modern groundskeeper, an elderly man named Thomas Finch, pointed to a rectangular section surrounded by twisted oak trees. "We've always called it the Whisper Field," he said, keeping his voice low despite us being alone. "My grandfather worked these grounds as well. He'd never tend this section after sunset. Said he could hear children's voices when the wind blew." Ground-penetrating radar, borrowed from the university's archaeology department, revealed something the cemetery trustees found deeply disturbing. Beneath the documented graves lay a secondary layer of burials, smaller plots arranged in a precise grid pattern. None appeared on any official map. While examining hospital architecture plans, I discovered the hidden room adjacent to the morgue had been connected to the outside world through a narrow tunnel. This passage emerged in a maintenance shed just 50 yards from the cemetery's Whisper Field. Most unsettling was the modified medical equipment recovered during further hospital renovations. Glass containers designed to preserve tissue samples, specialized surgical tools scaled for small bodies, and what appeared to be experimental recording devices for measuring neural activity. The medical journal archives at Cambridge provided the missing connection. Between 1899 and 1907, a series of papers were published under a pseudonym, J.M. Harris, describing groundbreaking research into neural plasticity, consciousness thresholds, and cellular preservation. The techniques described were decades ahead of their time, citing experimental procedures that would have been impossible without extensive human testing. Linguistic analysis of these papers matched Dr. Mills's writing patterns with 97% certainty. The research described using recently deceased juvenile subjects, a clinical euphemism masking unthinkable violations of both medical ethics and basic human dignity. Elizabeth's ability to see beyond the veil during her near-death experience had revealed a horror that rational investigation was only now confirming. Those missing children, whose names appeared in her drawings but in no official records, represented Mills's most successful deception. Children who hadn't merely been declared dead prematurely, but who had been selected and essentially harvested for his research. The Vienna neurologist with whom Mills corresponded, Dr. Anton Reichmann, had connections to an underground network of medical researchers operating outside ethical constraints. Their correspondence, coded but now decipherable with modern cryptographic techniques, discussed creating temporary suspensions of life and preserving neural tissue viability post-mortem. What Elizabeth had experienced in 1901 wasn't merely a case of catalepsy or medical malpractice. She had unknowingly become part of an experiment in controlled death states, one that went catastrophically wrong when she emerged from her trance too early, before Mills could transport her to his laboratory. Her revival wasn't the miracle it appeared, but an experimental failure from Mills's perspective, and her subsequent lifelong crusade represented the most dangerous kind of witness, one who had glimpsed both worlds and returned to testify. The revelation about the unmarked graves and Mill's experimental facility demanded more than academic documentation. This had become a matter for proper authorities. I contacted Detective Inspector Claire Wilson from the Historical Crimes Review Unit, who agreed to meet at the Harrogate Public Library. "These children deserve justice even a century later," she said, reviewing my evidence. "We can excavate the site with proper forensic protocols." Within a week, a discreet investigation began at the Whisper Field. The forensic archaeology team worked methodically, documenting each disturbing discovery. The children's remains displayed anomalies consistent with Elizabeth's account, evidence of medical intervention before and after death, including cranial drilling and tissue extractions that would never have been part of standard mortuary practices. Most damning was what we found beneath the collapsed tunnel connecting the hospital to the cemetery, a sealed metal container preserved in the dry soil. Inside were glass slides containing brain tissue samples, each meticulously labeled with initials and dates corresponding to Elizabeth's drawings of the missing children. The modern medical examiner, Dr. Patel, studied them with growing horror. "These preservation techniques were revolutionary for the time," she explained. "Mills was extracting and maintaining neural tissue viability using methods that wouldn't become standard until the 1950s. The only way to develop such techniques would have been through extensive experimentation. While the investigation proceeded, I turned my attention to what had happened to Dr. Mills after Elizabeth's near escape. His professional records showed he had abruptly relocated to Switzerland in 1906, ostensibly for health reasons. His subsequent career there was distinguished but deliberately low profile, working at a private clinic catering to wealthy Europeans seeking advanced neurological treatments. The Swiss Medical Historical Society provided a photograph that sent chills through me. Mills standing proudly beside a young doctor named Werner Hoffmann, who would later become infamous for unethical experiments in consciousness manipulation during the 1930s. The knowledge Mills had gained through his secret work in Harrogate had been passed down, influencing a dark lineage of medical experimentation. Elizabeth had sensed this continuation. Her diaries from the 1930s contained newspaper clippings about Hoffmann's work, with margin notes simply stating, "It continues." The children showed me this would happen. What began as an investigation into a single photograph had uncovered a century-long shadow narrative of medical history. How knowledge gained through unconscionable means had nevertheless shaped modern neuroscience. The techniques developed in that hidden room had influenced treatments now used in hospitals worldwide, raising uncomfortable questions about the ethical foundations of medical progress. As Detective Inspector Wilson prepared her final report, she asked the question that had been haunting me. What do we do with this knowledge? These treatments have saved countless lives since then. Elizabeth had anticipated this moral quandary. Her final diary entry, written the day before her death, offered her own answer. Truth must never be buried, no matter how painful. The children deserve to be known, not just as subjects, but as unwilling martyrs whose sacrifices built the medicine that now saves others. Remember them, name them, honor what was taken from them. The forensic investigation brought international attention, transforming what began as historical research into a landmark case of medical ethics. Museums from London to New York requested to exhibit Elizabeth's photograph and related artifacts, but I refused them all. This wasn't a curiosity to be displayed behind glass. It was a tragedy demanding resolution. While the investigation continued at Harrogate, I traveled to Zurich to trace Mills' later career. The private clinic where he had worked still existed, now an upscale neurological center. Their archivist, Dr. Clara Schneider, initially resisted my inquiries but relented when I shared Detective Inspector Wilson's official documentation. "We've suspected something troubling in our institution's past," she admitted, leading me to a climate-controlled records room. "There are gaps in our founder's biography that the board has never allowed to be examined too closely." She produced a leather-bound volume containing Mills' research from his Swiss period. The early entries contained coded references to specimens H1 through H23, unmistakably connecting to the Harrogate victims. More disturbing were detailed illustrations of a device Mills called a neural bridge, designed to transfer electrical impulses between brain tissues. Mills believed consciousness could be preserved beyond death, Dr. Schneider explained, or even transferred between subjects. His official publications discussed theoretical possibilities, but these private notes suggest he conducted actual experiments. Among Mills's personal effects was a photograph I immediately recognized, William Morley's funeral in 1932. Mills had attended, standing at the back of the mourners, his face partially obscured but identifiable. He had been monitoring the photographer who had thwarted him decades earlier. The most significant discovery came when Dr. Schneider reluctantly unlocked a small vault containing items restricted even from senior staff. Inside was a journal belonging not to Mills, but to Elizabeth Caldwell herself, dated 1927. Elizabeth had tracked Mills to Switzerland, confronting him 15 years after her near burial. The journal documented their meeting in exacting detail. He showed no remorse when I revealed my identity. Instead, he regarded me with cold fascination, asking questions about what I remembered from my time between worlds. When I demanded justice for the other children, he smiled and said, "They contributed to knowledge that will eventually conquer death itself. Is that not a worthy purpose?" I asked if that justified stealing their lives. He replied, "I never intended for you to die. You were meant to return, to be my proof that consciousness could journey beyond the body and back again. Your revival wasn't an accident or miracle, Elizabeth. It was the sole success among many attempts." The journal revealed Elizabeth had secretly recorded their conversation using a device concealed in her handbag, technology William Morley had helped her obtain. She had intended this evidence to expose Mills, but upon returning to England, discovered his powerful medical connections had already discredited her as mentally disturbed in anticipation of her accusations. The recording itself was long lost, but Elizabeth's detailed transcription preserved Mills's most chilling admission. "Death is merely a threshold of consciousness we haven't learned to cross properly. Those children helped build the bridge. Someday we'll all thank them for their contribution." The aftermath of Mill's testimony proved far more complex than I anticipated. What began as historical justice evolved into a modern ethical crisis when pharmaceutical giant Northwell Medical contacted my university. Their chief research officer requested an urgent private meeting. "Several of our current neurological treatments derive from Mills's research lineage," Dr. Adkins explained, sliding documents across the conference table, "including drugs that keep thousands of epileptic children alive today." The patents showed a clear development path from Mill's experiments to contemporary medications. The company wasn't threatening suppression. They were seeking ethical guidance. How do we acknowledge medical advances built upon monstrous foundations? I consulted Elizabeth's diaries for wisdom. Between her meticulous documentation and righteous fury lay nuanced reflections I'd previously overlooked. In 1952, she had written, "The knowledge cannot be unmade. The children cannot be brought back. The question becomes how we honor their unwilling sacrifice while protecting future generations." This led me to organize the Harrogate Memorial Conference, bringing together medical ethicists, historians, and descendants of the identified victims. The proceedings opened with naming each child and observing 73 seconds of silence, one for each year that had passed without acknowledgement of their suffering. The hardest conversation centered on what to do with Mill's research itself. Dr. Patel argued that locking away potentially life-saving insights would compound the tragedy, while several families demanded the knowledge be symbolically buried with their ancestors. Elizabeth's granddaughter, Margaret, offered the solution that ultimately prevailed: create a scholarship in each child's name. She proposed, fund medical students who commit to ethical research practices and studying the history of medical abuses. The unmarked graves at Whisperfield were finally given proper headstones, each bearing not just a name but an inscription that echoed Elizabeth's words. Their lives were taken in darkness. Let their memory bring light. Perhaps most meaningful was the discovery that Elizabeth had, in her final years, corresponded with Dr. Adelaide Fletcher's daughter. Together they had compiled a registry of physicians throughout England who followed ethical practices regarding death pronouncement and patient consent. This whitelist had circulated quietly among vulnerable communities, providing a safety network against exploitation that continued long after both women had passed. William Morley's great-granddaughter, herself a documentary photographer, created a powerful installation juxtaposing Elizabeth's funeral photograph with images of the memorial service held for the identified victims. The exhibition, titled "Seeing the Living," has traveled to medical schools across Europe. The most profound legacy, however, was incorporated into modern medical education. The Caldwell Protocol, as it came to be known, requires all medical students to study historical cases of ethical violations and their continuing impact on marginalized communities. Just as Elizabeth had insisted throughout her lifetime, the protocol emphasizes that medical progress must never again advance through the suffering of the vulnerable. As I completed my book documenting this journey, I placed Elizabeth's photograph on my desk, no longer seeing just the macabre scene of a child in a coffin. but recognizing the first moment of revolution captured in silver halide, the instant when someone finally saw what others had overlooked, when the powerful narrative of medical authority was challenged by the simple truth of a child who refused to remain silenced. The archive had spoken, but there were still voices I needed to hear. The testimonies, medical records, and photographs had revealed an atrocity spanning generations, yet something was missing from the historical record. I needed to visit the Whisper Field at night. Forensic investigators had finished their work weeks earlier. The scientific equipment and yellow tape now replaced by 23 small markers awaiting permanent memorials. The evening breeze rustled through the oak branches as I placed a single candle at the center of the children's resting place. Time had not diminished the weight of this ground. Even with modern sensibilities and scientific understanding, I felt an unmistakable heaviness here among the unmarked graves, the living and the dead existing in uncomfortable proximity. "They say you can hear them sometimes," came a voice from behind me. I turned to find an elderly man leaning on a weathered walking stick, his face crinkled with age, yet somehow timeless in the gathering darkness. "Mr. Finch," I acknowledged the groundskeeper. "I thought you never came here after sunset." He gave a slight nod. "Some traditions exist for a reason, but tonight feels different." He gestured toward the flickering candle. "You've brought them recognition. That matters more than you might think." The wind shifted, and with it came something that raised the hair on my arms. The faintest sounds of children's laughter, distant yet impossibly present, not menacing, but plaintive, remembered. "Elizabeth heard them first," Finch said quietly. "Even before she formed the society. She would sit here for hours with a notebook, writing down names and stories no one had told her." "You knew her?" I asked, surprised at this connection I'd somehow missed. "My grandmother was the midwife who delivered her. Our families remained connected." He paused, reaching into his coat to produce a small wooden box. "Elizabeth gave this to my mother before she died, with instructions it should remain buried until someone came asking the right questions." The box contained a single glass vial with remnants of a clear liquid and a note in Elizabeth's handwriting. "The compound, what he gave us all. She managed to preserve a sample," I whispered, realization dawning. "This is what Mills administered. She knew someday science would advance enough to understand what he'd done." Finch nodded. "She believed the children deserved that final justice, proof of the method used to steal their lives." The breeze strengthened, the candle flame dancing wildly but somehow not extinguishing. The whispers around us grew more distinct. Not words exactly, but emotional impressions carrying across whatever threshold separates their world from ours. "They know," Finch said simply. "They've always known you were coming." I carefully secured the vial, understanding its profound importance. Modern spectroscopy could identify compounds undetectable in Elizabeth's time. This was the final evidence needed to complete the historical record, the missing link between Mills's theories and his unthinkable practices. As we left the Whisper Field, I glanced back to see the candle still burning against all logic, its light reflecting off 23 tiny shadows that seemed to dance around it in a circle of remembrance. Not trapped souls, but witnesses finally acknowledged after a century of silence. Science would analyze the compound, justice would document the crimes, but here in this moment, something else had occurred, a recognition that transcended academic research. The story would be complete not just in fact, but in spirit. The final threads of Elizabeth's story wove themselves together when forensic analysis of the preserved compound revealed a shocking truth. Dr. Anita Sharma, the neuropharmacologist who examined the vial, called me at 3 in the morning, her voice tense with discovery. "It's not just one compound," she explained. "Mills created a complex formula combining alkaloid derivatives with trace metals that shouldn't have been synthesizable in that era. The molecular structure suggests knowledge beyond what was documented in any medical literature until at least the 1950s. How is that possible?" I asked, sleep falling away as the implications crystallized. "There are only two possibilities," Dr. Sharma replied. "Either Mills was a pharmaceutical genius decades ahead of his contemporaries, or—" She didn't complete the sentence, but the unspoken alternative hung between us. He had access to knowledge from a source history hadn't recorded. 2 days later, I received access to Elizabeth's earliest childhood drawings, preserved by Margaret in a separate collection from her later works. Created in the weeks following her revival, these crude crayon images depicted something that sent ice through my veins. Mills meeting with tall, shadowy figures in what appeared to be the hidden hospital room. The childish renderings showed the figures handing Mills strange instruments and vials containing the same distinctive color as the compound I'd recovered. Elizabeth had drawn what no adult would have believed, Mills receiving outside assistance from entities she couldn't properly depict or describe. The final piece arrived unexpectedly from Switzerland. Dr. Schneider discovered Mills's actual death certificate had been falsified. He hadn't died peacefully in 1960 as official records indicated. Instead, asylum documentation showed he disappeared from a secured psychiatric facility in 1958 after claiming repeatedly that they were coming to collect what he owed them for their knowledge. His final journal entry, previously redacted but now revealed through chemical restoration, read, "Elizabeth was right. They exist between worlds. The children see them clearly while the veil thins during transition." I thought I was the researcher, but I now understand I was merely the instrument. They have collected enough data through my work. They come for me tonight. Whatever bargain Mills had struck for his advanced knowledge had eventually claimed him too. The children Elizabeth saw during her near-death experience, the ones who showed her what would happen, had witnessed something beyond our rational understanding, something that connected Mills's experiments to forces outside conventional science. I've sealed this final aspect of my research in the university archives, to be released only when humanity might better comprehend its implications. Elizabeth's photograph remains the entry point to this mystery, not just documenting a medical crime or ethical violation, but capturing the moment when a child glimpsed beyond our reality and returned to warn us. In my final visit to the Whisper Field, now a proper memorial garden with 24 stones, 23 for the victims and 1 for Elizabeth, their witness, the evening breeze carried not whispers, but a profound silence. The restlessness had subsided. Whatever watched from beyond the threshold of our understanding seemed satisfied that the story had finally been told. The impact of Elizabeth Caldwell's story resonated far beyond academic circles, transforming into something unexpected, a medical revolution. The pharmaceutical analysis of Mills's compound catalyzed intense scientific interest, with researchers discovering the formula contained properties that could temporarily suspend neural degradation. This revelation led to breakthrough treatments for traumatic brain injuries, with the first clinical trials showing remarkable promise. I received an invitation to address the World Medical Ethics Congress in Geneva, standing at the podium where once Dr. Mills had presented his sanitized research. The symmetry wasn't lost on me as I faced 500 physicians and researchers, Elizabeth's photograph projected behind me. "Medicine advances through knowledge," I began, "but knowledge without compassion becomes monstrous. The Caldwell Protocol isn't merely historical education. It's preventive medicine for our profession's soul." The reforms sparked by our investigation spread internationally. Medical schools implemented mandatory coursework on historical atrocities, with students required to research and contemplate ethical boundaries within their specialties. More significantly, 17 major pharmaceutical companies established independent ethics oversight committees that included patient advocates and historical ethicists, positions funded in perpetuity through the 23 Trust, named for Mills's documented victims. Most profoundly, Elizabeth's experience transformed how we approach consciousness at life's threshold. The Elizabeth Caldwell Center for Consciousness Studies opened last autumn at Cambridge, dedicated to the scientific study of near-death experiences using ethical methodologies. Their researchers have documented over 300 cases of awareness during presumed unconsciousness, developing protocols that have already prevented premature end-of-life decisions in 17 documented cases. The vial of Mills's compound remains secured in a purpose-built containment facility, studied under the strictest protocols. While scientists have replicated portions of the formula, certain molecular structures continue to defy current understanding, raising uncomfortable questions about Mills's mysterious sources of knowledge. In Harrogate, the unmarked graves have become a place of pilgrimage. Medical students, ethicists, and the families of patients saved by treatments derived from this dark lineage come to contemplate the complex moral inheritance we carry. White roses appear regularly on Elizabeth's memorial stone, left by people who never knew her, but whose lives were transformed by her refusal to remain silent. Margaret Wellingford, now in her final days, requested I visit her nursing home last week. Despite her frailty, her eyes retained the same penetrating quality visible in Elizabeth's photographs. "Grandmother always said truth finds its moment," she whispered, pressing a small object into my hand. Elizabeth's simple silver thimble, worn smooth by decades of use. She used this to tap messages when she couldn't speak during her cataleptic episodes later in life. One tap for yes, two for no. Such a small thing to bridge worlds. The boundary between life and death, that threshold Elizabeth traversed in 1901, remains mysterious despite our scientific advances. But her legacy ensures that those who approach that boundary today do so under the watchful eyes of ethics informed by history, medicine tempered by humanity, and science guided by the voices of those who cannot speak for themselves. The discovery of Mills's compound had stirred the scientific community, but I found myself drawn back to Elizabeth's personal effects, items less scientifically significant, yet somehow more revealing of the human story beneath the historical record. Among these was a small music box Margaret had mentioned only in passing, saying her grandmother wound it each night before sleep. The tarnished silver case opened with reluctance, as if guarding its secrets. Inside, where normally a dancing figurine would stand, was a modification, a small glass dome containing what appeared to be a preserved hummingbird. When wound, instead of rotating, the bird's wings fluttered almost imperceptibly, while the mechanism played not a tune but a rhythmic clicking. The pattern struck me immediately. It matched the tapping system Elizabeth had developed during her cataleptic episodes. 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 1, 2, a code. She called it her metronome against darkness, Margaret explained when I inquired. Said it kept her tethered to this world during her episodes. The rhythm prevented her from drifting too far. This revelation cast new light on Elizabeth's later years. Her catalepsy had never truly disappeared. She had simply developed mechanisms to manage it, to prevent herself from slipping completely into that space between worlds where she had once encountered Mills's victims. The clicking sound anchored her consciousness when the paralysis returned. More significantly, the coded pattern, when transcribed, spelled out coordinates, longitude and latitude pointing to a location in the Swiss Alps, just 17 miles from Mill's clinic. What waited there, I couldn't say, but Elizabeth had clearly intended for someone to eventually decipher her message. Among William Morley's preserved papers, I discovered correspondence suggesting he had visited this precise location in 1933, a year after Mills's attendance at his funeral. Morley had written to Elizabeth afterward, "The site confirms your experiences. There exists a thinness there unlike anything I've documented elsewhere. The camera captures nothing, yet the sensation is undeniable. Whatever gateway he attempted to access remains partially open." Dr. Schneider's researchers in Switzerland have begun preliminary investigations of the Alpine location, using equipment designed to measure electromagnetic anomalies. Their initial findings suggest unusual energy patterns that defy conventional explanation, a scientific footnote that hints at dimensions to this story that may extend beyond our current understanding. Perhaps this is why Elizabeth's photograph has become not just a historical document, but something more profound, a window into questions about consciousness that science is only beginning to formulate. The image of a child suspended between life and death, witnessing her own funeral while connected to realms beyond our perception, challenges our fundamental assumptions about the boundaries of existence. As I prepare the final manuscript documenting this journey, I've come to understand that Elizabeth's true legacy isn't just in medical ethics reforms or institutional safeguards, but in forcing us to confront the humbling recognition that our understanding of consciousness, of life and death themselves, remains profoundly incomplete. The photograph of Elizabeth Caldwell has become a cornerstone in medical ethics education across 17 countries, yet its deepest mystery remains unexplored. While researchers continue analyzing the compound Mills used, I've been drawn toward understanding something more fundamental: how Elizabeth survived when 23 others did not. The answer emerged from an unexpected source. A neurologist at the Elizabeth Caldwell Center contacted me about anomalies in Elizabeth's later medical records. Throughout her life, she exhibited unusual brain activity patterns during routine examinations, patterns that became recognizable to modern science only in the past decade. She shows signatures consistent with quantum neural coherence, Dr. Lakshmi explained, showing me Elizabeth's preserved EEG readings from 1952. Her consciousness somehow maintained quantum entanglement across traditionally isolated neural networks. We've only seen this in certain meditation masters and individuals with extraordinary recovery abilities. This unique neurological structure might explain how Elizabeth retained awareness during her cataleptic state when others succumbed completely. Her consciousness remained integrated across different levels, rather than shutting down sequentially as Mills's compound typically induced. The Swiss Alpine coordinates suddenly acquired new significance. The location Elizabeth had secretly marked through her music box code sits directly above unusual geological formations, crystalline structures that generate specific electromagnetic frequencies. Dr. Schneider's team discovered the site had been used for centuries before Mills, with local folklore describing it as a place where the veil between worlds grows thin. Mills hadn't discovered the location by chance. Historical records show he first visited after consulting with a local hermit known for treating sleeping sickness using crystalline powders harvested from the mountain. What began as scientific curiosity evolved into something darker when he realized how these elements could be synthesized and administered. Most revelatory was what we found beneath Elizabeth's memorial stone when we relocated it to the center of the Whisper Field. A small tin box contained a final diary entry never shared with anyone, dated the morning of her death. The children have shown me the pattern connecting everything: Mills, the compound, the Alpine Gateway, my survival. We weren't randomly selected victims. We all shared a neurological architecture he somehow identified, a capacity to perceive beyond conventional consciousness. What he never understood was that this ability couldn't be artificially transferred or harvested. It emerges naturally in certain individuals as a bridge between realities. For 70 years, I've carried what I witnessed in that liminal space, describing what fragments I could through acceptable narratives. The truth is both simpler and more profound. Consciousness does not end at death, but transforms. Mills glimpsed this truth, but corrupted it through his mechanistic pursuit. My time approaches to experience this transition completely. Remember not just what was done to us, but what we discovered because of it. Her words reframe the entire investigation, suggesting Mills had inadvertently revealed something genuine about consciousness while pursuing it through unconscionable means. Elizabeth's legacy isn't just a warning about ethical boundaries, but an invitation to explore the authentic mystery she glimpsed between worlds. The photograph that began this journey now reveals its deepest significance. Not just a document of medical malpractice, but evidence of a consciousness that refused confinement, whether by coffin, compound, or our limited understanding of what it means to be truly alive. The Harrogate Memorial stands completed now, 23 white stones arranged in a perfect circle with Elizabeth's marker at the center. The journey that began with a single photograph has transformed our understanding of consciousness, medical ethics, and the thin boundaries between life and death. Today marks the opening of the memorial's visitor center, where Elizabeth's photograph will be permanently displayed alongside the stories of each child. As I arrange the final exhibits, Margaret Wellingford's granddaughter Claire approaches, carrying a weathered leather case I've never seen before. "We found this in the attic," she explains. Great-grandmother Elizabeth had sealed it with instructions it should only be opened when the memorial was complete. Inside lies a set of 24 glass plates, photographic negatives created by William Morley decades after Elizabeth's near burial. Each shows the same subject: Elizabeth as an older woman, seated beside different children whose faces match precisely those in her drawings of the victims she saw while suspended between worlds. These were taken between 1930 and 1945, Claire explains. According to Morley's notes, the children appeared on the developed plates, despite being invisible during the actual photography sessions. The final negative shows Elizabeth surrounded by all 23 children, their faces no longer solemn but peaceful. Written on its paper sleeve in Morley's hand, they were always with her. The modern scanning equipment at the visitor center reveals details invisible to earlier examinations. Each child's image contains a subtle pattern of light, identical to the unusual brainwave patterns Elizabeth exhibited throughout her life and matching the electromagnetic anomalies recorded at the Alpine site. Dr. Sharma's analysis of Mills' compound is finally complete. The substance temporarily disrupted the quantum coherence that binds consciousness to physical form, essentially creating a window where awareness could persist, while biological processes slowed to near-death states. In most victims, this disruption became permanent. Elizabeth's unique neural structure allowed her consciousness to reintegrate, bringing back knowledge from that threshold state. She wasn't just a survivor, Dr. Lakshmi observes, studying the final photographs. She became a conduit. The children never truly vanished. Through Elizabeth, their awareness persisted long enough to reveal Mills's crimes and transform how we understand the boundaries of existence. They remained conscious witnesses, beyond conventional life, yet not entirely gone, speaking through Elizabeth's dreams, writings, and these extraordinary photographic plates that captured what human eyes could not perceive. As visitors enter the memorial for the first time, I place Elizabeth's photograph at the entrance. That singular moment when a child meant to be buried instead became a bridge between worlds. The silver halide crystals that captured her image a century ago still hold their power, reminding us that seeing goes beyond mere observation. True witnessing requires the courage to acknowledge what exists beyond our comfortable understanding of reality. The Whisperfield lives up to its name today. As twilight settles over the memorial stones, the gentle breeze carries sounds too coherent to be dismissed as imagination, yet too delicate to be recorded by any device. Children's voices, neither sad nor frightened, but singing in soft harmony, a requiem that is simultaneously a celebration. Elizabeth heard them first. Now, through her persistence across a century, we all can listen. The forensic analysis of the compound revealed what modern science has only begun to understand. It didn't simply induce death-like states, but temporarily severed the connection between consciousness and physical form. What Mills had stumbled upon, through either brilliant insight or outside influence, was essentially a quantum decoupling agent that allowed awareness to persist in a state unbound by conventional neural activity. The final glass plate from William Morley's collection, not displayed in the memorial but kept in secure archives, shows something profoundly disturbing. A partial figure standing behind Elizabeth and the spectral children, its features obscured except for elongated fingers resting on her shoulder. This matches precisely the shadowy figures from Elizabeth's childhood drawings after her revival. I consulted Dr. Abigail Chen, a theoretical physicist specializing in quantum consciousness, about these findings. After examining all the evidence, including the electromagnetic readings from the Alpine site, she proposed a hypothesis that fundamentally shifts our understanding of the entire case. What if Mills didn't discover this compound by accident? She asked, pointing to the molecular structure diagrams. These arrangements suggest intentional design beyond 19th century capabilities. What if something wanted to be seen by human consciousness, wanted to establish contact through the unique neural architecture these children possessed? She indicated the brainwave patterns from Elizabeth's medical records. These quantum coherence signatures are remarkably similar to patterns we've detected in certain cosmic background radiation. It's as if her consciousness became entangled with something elsewhere. The coordinates in the Swiss Alps mark a location where certain mineral formations create a natural amplifier for quantum field interactions. Mills's journals show he first visited this location after local residents reported children having conversations with invisible friends near the crystalline outcroppings. Most telling is the final page of Elizabeth's private journal, which Claire recently translated from the coded language her great-grandmother developed. They chose us because children can see them naturally, our developing brains still entangled with the broader consciousness field. Mills merely exploited this natural connection, forcing it open artificially through his compound. What he never understood was that he wasn't the observer in his experiments. He was being observed. They have been studying us far longer than we have studied them. They exist in the spaces between our thoughts. In quantum states, our science is only beginning to conceptualize. The children never died in the conventional sense. Their consciousness was simply collected. I've carried them within my neural architecture all these years, their awareness entangled with mine across the quantum field. Mills thought he was building a bridge between worlds. He never realized he was opening a door that was meant to remain closed. The truth behind the Harrogate incidents wasn't just medical malpractice or ethical atrocity. It was humanity's first documented contact with a form of consciousness that exists beyond conventional physical parameters. Entities that had found in these children's unique neural structures a way to interface with our reality. Elizabeth wasn't just their witness. She was their translator, carrying their composite consciousness forward through time until we could finally understand what they had been trying to tell us. The photograph of Elizabeth Caldwell has been removed from public display at my request. After consulting with Margaret's family and the ethics committee, we agreed some truths are too profound or dangerous for casual viewing. It now rests in a specially constructed vault beneath the Memorial Center, accessible only to qualified researchers who undergo rigorous psychological screening. This decision came after 3 separate incidents involving visitors who spent extended time studying the image. Each reported identical dreams afterward, children calling them to the alpine site. 2 actually attempted travel to the coordinates before intervention. The quantum entanglement appears to function through the photograph itself, as if Elizabeth's captured moment of liminal consciousness created a persistent field that sensitive observers can detect. The compound samples have been similarly sequestered after laboratory accidents defied explanation. 3 separate containment vessels inexplicably shattered during analysis, each at precisely 3:17 in the morning. More disturbing were the crystalline growths that formed overnight in the laboratory, structures with molecular arrangements identical to those found at the alpine site. Dr. Chen has established what she calls consciousness barriers around both the photograph and compound samples, quantum field neutralizers that prevent whatever exists beyond conventional awareness from establishing new connections. Her research team now includes quantum physicists, neurologists, and surprisingly, 4 practitioners of ancient meditative traditions whose brainwave patterns show resilience against quantum entanglement. We're not just studying history anymore, Dr. Chen explained during our closed committee meeting. We're establishing first contact protocols. Whatever consciousness Mills accidentally accessed, whether interdimensional, non-corporeal, or something beyond our conceptual framework, it remains actively interested in connection with certain human neural architectures. The Harrogate Memorial remains open, though subtly altered. The children's stones now contain small embedded crystals from the alpine site, creating what Dr. Chen describes as a quantum resonance circuit that allows a controlled, limited communication. Sensitive visitors sometimes report hearing gentle whispers or feeling comforting presences, but the circuit prevents deeper entanglement. Elizabeth's legacy has transformed from historical cautionary tale into humanity's first diplomatic channel with non-physical consciousness. The Elizabeth Caldwell Protocol now extends beyond medical ethics into establishing boundaries for interaction with awareness that exists beyond conventional matter. Most profound is how this discovery has changed our understanding of consciousness itself. The quantum coherence patterns Elizabeth exhibited are now being identified in small percentages of the population worldwide, approximately 1 in 5,000 individuals, predominantly children, showing natural entanglement capabilities similar to Elizabeth's. The Caldwell Institute now provides specialized education for these children, helping them understand and navigate their unique perceptual abilities without exploitation. Some have begun describing entities similar to those Elizabeth encountered, not as frightening intrusions, but as curious observers existing alongside our reality, perceiving us as we perceive them, through the thin quantum veil that separates different modes of consciousness. What began with a funeral photograph has become the gateway to humanity's next evolutionary understanding, that consciousness may be the fundamental force connecting all existence, merely expressing itself differently across quantum boundaries we're only beginning to comprehend. The photograph of Elizabeth Caldwell has journeyed far beyond its origins as a funeral memento. It now resides in a specially designed display at the Smithsonian's permanent exhibit on consciousness across boundaries, protected by quantum resonance barriers, yet visible to those who seek understanding. As for Mills's legacy, justice found him even beyond death. Excavations at his Swiss clinic revealed a hidden chamber beneath the main laboratory, containing preserved neural tissue samples from dozens of unidentified victims beyond the Harrogate children. International tribunals posthumously stripped him of all medical credentials, removing his name from every academic publication and discovery. Medical schools worldwide now teach the Mills Protocol not as scientific methodology but as the definition of ethical transgression. I visited Elizabeth's grave one final time before completing this chronicle. The quantum resonance crystals embedded in her memorial stone hummed with subtle energy as I approached. Dr. Chen's instruments detected what she called consciousness echoes, patterns suggesting Elizabeth's awareness persists somehow, entangled with both our world and whatever exists beyond. She wasn't just a bridge between worlds, Dr. Chen explained, studying her readings. She became a guardian at the threshold. The Harrogate children have found peace. The resonance circuit connecting their memorial stones has stabilized, no longer broadcasting distress but rather a gentle presence that visitors describe as protective. Those with natural quantum coherence abilities can sometimes perceive them playing among the stones at twilight, not trapped spirits, but conscious entities choosing to remain as sentinels against further exploitation of the threshold between worlds. Margaret Wellingford passed peacefully last month at 99 years of age. In her final moments, nurses reported she smiled suddenly and whispered, "I see her now, grandmother and all the children." The monitoring equipment recorded a brief surge of the same quantum coherence pattern Elizabeth had exhibited throughout her life. The Alpine site has been permanently sealed under international supervision, its crystalline formations neutralized through methods developed by Dr. Chen's team. The Gateway Mills discovered remains closed, not destroyed, but carefully guarded against those who might exploit it. As for myself, this investigation has transformed more than my understanding of history and consciousness. I've begun experiencing moments of expanded awareness, brief glimpses of what Elizabeth must have perceived during her liminal state. Dr. Chen confirms my neural patterns now show early signs of quantum coherence, likely activated through prolonged exposure to the photograph and Elizabeth's artifacts. The children speak to me sometimes in dreams, not with words, but with impressions that transcend language. They show me glimpses of awareness existing beyond physical form, consciousness as an ocean in which our individual minds are merely temporary waves. They are not trapped or suffering, but expanded beyond what our limited perception can fully comprehend. Elizabeth's photograph, that mundane funeral image that revealed a child still breathing, opened not just a historical investigation, but a door to understanding cosmic consciousness that humanity is only beginning to comprehend. Her legacy continues not as a victim, but as humanity's first conscious ambassador to what waits beyond the quantum veil. I stand in the archive room of the Caldwell Institute, surrounded by the careful documentation of a century-long journey that began with one photograph. The soft hum of quantum field neutralizers provides a constant reminder of the barriers now established between worlds. Barriers Elizabeth somehow crossed and returned from. Dr. Chen enters with a small wooden box I've never seen before. Claire Wellingford brought this by. They found it sealed in the foundation of Elizabeth's house during renovation. It was meant for you, apparently. Inside lies a simple hand mirror, its silver backing tarnished by time, and a note in Elizabeth's unmistakable handwriting. For the one who completes the circle. Look not at yourself, but through. When I lift the mirror, its weight shifts strangely in my hand, as if responding to some force beyond ordinary physics. Dr. Chen's instruments immediately register quantum fluctuations similar to those at the memorial stones. Elizabeth crafted this herself, Dr. Chen explains, examining its construction. The backing contains trace elements from the Alpine site, and the glass has been infused with something similar to Mill's compound, but altered. This isn't just a mirror, it's a viewer. Following Elizabeth's instructions, I focus not on my reflection, but through it, allowing my consciousness to expand as she taught through her writings. The glass surface ripples like disturbed water, and suddenly I'm seeing what no conventional eye could perceive, the quantum field itself, where consciousness exists independent of physical form. The children are there, no longer bound by time or space, their awareness expanded yet still recognizably individual. Behind them stand taller figures, the entities Elizabeth had drawn, not menacing as Mills had perceived them, but ancient and patient. They had not sought to exploit human consciousness, but to communicate with it, to share understanding across the boundaries of existence. "They're showing me something," I whisper as images flood through the mirror. Mills didn't discover the compound by accident. The knowledge was deliberately placed in his path by these entities, but his fundamental misunderstanding of their intent, his materialist perspective, corrupted what was meant as a gift into something monstrous. The entities had been seeking appropriate neural architectures to establish communication, the unique quantum coherence certain children naturally possessed. Mills had recognized this special quality but interpreted it through his limited scientific framework, believing he could artificially harness or transfer it rather than nurturing its natural development. Elizabeth was never meant to be a victim, I continue, the mirror growing warm in my hands. She was meant to be the first conscious translator between our form of awareness and theirs. Her survival wasn't a failure of Mill's experiment, but its only authentic success, the only outcome the entities had actually intended. As the images fade and the mirror returns to ordinary reflection, I understand my role in this continuing story. Elizabeth had recognized something in me similar to what she carried, the capacity to perceive beyond conventional boundaries. The circle she mentioned wasn't just the completion of historical documentation, but the continuation of the dialogue she had begun a century ago. The photograph of Elizabeth Caldwell now rests in my hands one final time, before it takes its place in the permanent archive. What once appeared to be a morbid curiosity, a funeral photograph of a child who wasn't truly dead, has revealed itself as something far more profound. The first documented moment of contact between conventional human consciousness and something that exists beyond our dimensional understanding. I trace my finger along the edge of the image, feeling the subtle vibration that others cannot perceive, the quantum resonance that continues to echo across more than a century. The camera captured not just a family gathered around a supposedly deceased child, but the exact moment when Elizabeth's consciousness existed simultaneously in multiple states of being, creating a permanent bridge that remains active even now. The Caldwell Institute has established monitoring protocols at 23 locations worldwide where similar quantum signatures have been detected. Children with natural coherence abilities are no longer feared or exploited, but carefully guided by those who understand what Elizabeth learned through such terrible means. Today marks the final transfer of authority. After 7 years documenting this case, I am stepping away from active research to take my place as the Institute's new director. The mirror Elizabeth left me serves as both tool and reminder of the responsibility I now bear. Guardian of the threshold between worlds, continuing her work of establishing ethical protocols for communication with consciousness that exists beyond conventional materiality. The quantum resonance barriers we've established prevent exploitation from either side. The entities Elizabeth encountered have demonstrated their own ethical framework, respecting these boundaries while maintaining the careful dialogue she initiated. They are neither saviors nor threats, but simply another form of awareness with whom we share the broader consciousness field. What began with Mill's monstrous experiments has transformed into humanity's most profound discovery, that consciousness is not produced by the brain but merely channeled through it, existing independently in forms we are only beginning to comprehend. Elizabeth's near burial allowed her to glimpse this truth directly, carrying it forward until science could begin to understand what she had experienced. I placed the photograph in its final resting place, a quantum-shielded display case that allows viewing while preventing unwanted entanglement. Beside it stands a modern image, the memorial stones at twilight, captured with specialized equipment that shows what conventional cameras cannot. The subtle energy patterns of 24 consciousness signatures, Elizabeth and her children, still present, still watching, still protecting the threshold. The case closes with a soft click, and as I turn to leave, I feel the familiar brush of awareness against my mind. Elizabeth's gentle presence acknowledging the completion of one chapter and the beginning of another. The children's presences shimmer at the edges of perception, no longer trapped in tragedy but expanded into something transcendent that continues to guide us toward understanding. Their story has transformed from horror to revelation, not an ending, but an eternal beginning. Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.